Oh yay, oh yay, oh yay.
Welcome to our discussion of congressional elections. These are the topics that we are going to cover. What are the advantages an incumbent enjoys? How are congressional district lines determined? What are congressional election patterns? And what are characteristics of voting behavior? So let's get started with the incumbency advantage. Despite the similarities to other elections, congressional elections are a whole different animal. Most congressmen are relatively little known, with a few exceptions. And there is a huge advantage to the incumbent in congressional elections. So the incumbency advantage is the advantage of already being in office. For example, each member of the House gets approximately $750,000 in taxpayer money to run their office. And that's for things like constituency services. And those are the things that a congressman does to help voters in his or her district. It helps get that congressman's name out. It's an example of self-promotion. So that would be things like helping a constituent who needs assistance with a passport application, or helping a business wade through some paperwork. Anything that a congressman does to help their constituents as part of their normal job as a congressman is a constituency service. Congressmen and congresswomen are also highly visible in their district. Within their district, they do have a lot of name recognition. They also have a war chest. They have a large staff. They have the experience of having run a campaign before. Usually, all these things that make up the incumbency advantage scare off the challengers, and usually challengers will wait until there's an open seat to run. If 95% of the House is reelected, it is very tough to beat an incumbent in the House. So an open seat is when no incumbent is in the race, and this tends to create higher turnout. Senate races tend to receive more publicity compared to the House because there's less of them. They're statewide. They're on a bigger scale. The incumbency re-election rate in the Senate is a little bit lower than the House, but it's still very high. Now, these are some really, really important terms, and they're fascinating. Realignment and redistricting. Every 10 years, the census takes place. We know that the Constitution mentions the census taking place every 10 years. Since the House is based on population, a change in census numbers can mean a change in House districts. The Senate is based on equal representation, so changes in state population don't really affect the Senate, but they do affect the House. Each House district should have roughly the same number of people, and that's about 910,000 people. Some districts have more, some have less. But because of a court case called Baker versus Carr, each district is supposed to have an equal number of eligible voters. It's a Supreme Court case that said that the Supreme Court can control legislative apportionment. So this said that the Supreme Court could weigh into this political issue, which was a big deal. And Baker versus Carr established the principle of one man, one vote. Each district has to be relatively equal in terms of eligible voters. So here's reapportionment. If, when the census comes out every 10 years, there's a change in population, reapportionment happens, where that would actually give one state more seats and take away seats from another state. So it would change the number of congressional seats and congressional districts for a state based on changes in the census. And right now the trend is for the West and the South to gain seats at expense of the Northeast and the Midwest, the Rust Belt. So there's 435 congressional districts around the country, and that number was fixed in 1929. So there's always going to be 435 representatives, but the states that those representatives come from will change based on shifts in population. That is reapportionment, changing the number of seats in the House. Now, redistricting can happen with or without reapportionment. Redistricting is just redrawing state congressional districts. It can happen for one of two reasons. Number one, a gain or loss of congressional seats. So number one is basically because of reapportionment. Or it can happen because of shifting population within a state. So if lots of people in 10 years within a state move from the countryside to the city, then the congressional district boundaries would have to be redrawn within that state to reflect that population shift. The city might then be broken into two different congressional districts, and then the countryside might make a bigger congressional district because it has less people. So redistricting doesn't necessarily mean that the state has gained or lost seats. It could just reflect internal population movements, and the state could keep the same number of seats. They'd just be in different patterns. Now, this is a very important point. Redistricting is done by state legislatures. So whichever political party controls the state legislature at the time that redistricting happens or the reapportionment happens has a huge advantage. And when redistricting happens for political purposes, it's called gerrymandering. The majority party in each state legislature can use redistricting and reapportionment and realignment to ensure their continued power. The majority party in the state legislature can try to assure the maximum representation for their party in Congress by redrawing the congressional districts in a political way. Which brings up the question about, does a map maker have more power than the voter? Gerrymandering's been going on since the founding of the country, but there's a lot of attention now devoted to gerrymandering and how it can deprive people of legitimate political power. And this is where the term comes from. Elbridge Gerry was the politician that the name comes from, and his district on the left there, when drawn on a map, kind of looks like a salamander, so that's why gerrymander is the name. And then you can see a more modern example on the right, Illinois' 17th district in 2002, which doesn't look like a logistical district when drawn on a map because it was drawn for political purposes. Okay, so what are some patterns in congressional elections? Well, scandal can have an effect on how people vote. Traditional scandals have typically been things like bribery and payoffs, but there's been a lot of news about newer personal scandals that people have become involved in, like sexual escapades. But the thing is, incumbents in Congress typically do not lose re-elections because of scandal. They either retire or resign because of the scandal, or the power of the incumbency is so strong that they win anyway. Another factor that might influence congressional elections is this thing called coattails, where a successful presidential candidate, usually a national presidential candidate, usually will carry into office congressional candidates of the same party in the same election year. So when the president gets elected, if that president has a good campaign, then many congressmen from the president's same party will come into office at the same time too. These gains for coattails tend to be less pronounced in midterm elections. Those are elections that happen halfway through the presidential term. So the president is no longer on the ballot. And then there's something called the sophomore surge. When a congressman first runs for re-election, that candidate typically receives 8 to 10 percentage points more votes than he or she did in the first election. And again, it just goes to show the advantage of the incumbency. Now, we defined a midterm election just a few slides ago, but here's a little bit more information about patterns that we see with midterm elections. The trend is for the president's party to lose seat in midterm elections. Maybe the public wants to send the president a message. 2002 did buck that trend. For the first time in a long time in 2002, the president picked up seats in the middle of George W. Bush's first term. The trend is especially strong about the president's party losing seats in midterms if it's in the middle of the president's second term. So if it's in the 6th year of that presidency compared to the second. The Senate is typically less likely to follow this trend than the House. And, well, that's because the Senate is only up for re-election every 6 years, compared to the House, it's every 2 years. Midterm elections do also have a much lower voter turnout compared to presidential elections. The 1994 midterm elections were extraordinary in terms of this pattern of the president's party losing seats. Clinton lost a lot of seats in the 1994 midterm elections. He had a huge challenge with the number of seats lost to Republicans. And that takes us to the end of our look at congressional elections. Hope it helped, and good luck studying.